Great. So thank you all for coming out this evening. It's great to see some new faces. For those that don't know, we've been going through this book, The Air We Breathe, by Glenn Scrivener. And I don't know what you were expecting from this service this evening, what to hear. It's probably not what you were expecting. It's not what I expected to speak on about progress. But he has some very interesting, ideas and thought-provoking things that we should be thinking about. And so this whole concept about the air we breathe is, if you imagine a goldfish in water, the goldfish lives and breathes off of the water, but doesn't actually see the water. And that's kind of what Glenn Scrivener's argument is for Christianity. That Christianity has weaved itself through society, and it's kind of in the air that we breathe. And one of these concepts that it's in the air we breathe is in the concept of progress. And I do have to say that he does bring up some good points, but I personally... I wasn't as totally convinced as I was in other chapters, but we'll look at this together. We'll have a time of discussion, a time of Q&A, and hopefully I'll lead you to, as Jamie said, a wonderful picture of where we're going to as Christians. Because what we do know is that we are progressing towards a time where there will be no more death. There will be no more mourning, crying, or pain, and God's ultimate justice will be carried out. So, there's a quote by Reverend Theodore Parker, who was an abolitionist in America, that says, "Look at the facts of the world. You see a continual and progressive triumph of the right. I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience, but from what I see, I am sure that it bends towards justice." And Martin Luther King Jr. later paraphrased the quote as, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." And even Barack Obama, who was then the U.S. president, placed this quote in the Oval Office as a reminder for him as well. And it's because of men like Theodore Parker and MLK Jr. that most people believe that we live in a moral universe and one that is progressing. But this has not always been the case. If you think in previous cultures, the past was viewed better than the present. And the past is when we had heroes and gods. Greek poet Hesiod, in his poem Works and Days, you may have heard about the 5 ages of man. And he starts with the Golden Age, where humans freely mingle with the gods. And there's peace, harmony, there's no war, there's an abundance. And then humanity ends with the Iron Age, where humans live working hard and toil. There's war and misery. And it seemed like the only way that we were going was down, or that we were stuck in a cycle where we unravel time and time again. But the Bible, however, offers a different view of history, a view that we are progressing towards something, a view of an arrow going onwards and upwards. In the book of Exodus, we find the Israelites as slaves, but we also know that they were on their way to the land promised to them by God. And the Old Testament prophets were also full of such expectations. In Amos we read, "Let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream," a verse famously quoted by Martin Luther King Jr. in his "I Have a Dream" speech. And in fact, his speech was basically a church sermon with several scripture quotations, and without his Christian framework, his outlook for progress, for civil rights, would be unintelligible. Now, there's an atheist psychology professor at Harvard. He's called Steven Pinker, and he praises progress we have made in terms of life expectancy, infant mortality, health, wealth, peace, rights, education, and so much more. And despite being an atheist, Pinker admits that it seems there really is an arc bounding towards justice, even answering the question, does justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a mighty stream? And he answers it with an emphatic yes. Now, something Scrivener didn't touch on, but I thought was also a good base for human progress, is the idea that as Christians, we are always improving. There are two big theological terms we use: regeneration and sanctification. When God calls us to himself and we accept Jesus into our heart, regeneration happens, and the Holy Spirit dwells within us and makes us alive in Christ. And after this, sanctification happens, where God works within a Christian and transforms them from the inside, all throughout their life, until the work that began in regeneration is finished and we are made completely holy in heaven. And we see God's sanctifying work as Christians grow in Christ-like character, increasing love for God and other people, and we see more and more of the fruits of the Spirit in them. But there are dangers that we need to consider with the idea of progress. In the 19th century, we had a huge amount of progress. There was the Industrial Revolution, which brought about many transformations to many things. And great thinkers like Darwin, Hegel, and Freud, they claimed progress in their respective areas. Another example that you may have heard of is Karl Marx, that proclaimed economic and political progress. And Marx's communism, although opposed to the church, was in some ways an attempt to make the state into a church, a place where, quote, no one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had, from Acts chapter 4, verse 32. And scriptures do teach that God lifts up the lowly while bringing down the princes from their thrones. But what is the major difference between Marx's communism and Christianity? Well, the answer is people. In the Bible, God is the one that equalizes. But if humans get this role, bloody revolution tends to happen. And this led us into the 20th century, a century undoubtedly plagued by death in the name of progress. 20 million dead in World War I, 75 million in its sequel. Millions died for Lenin's revolution, with even millions more dying from Stalin. And there are 45 million between 1959 and 1962 that were worked, starved, or beaten to death under the leadership of Mao Zedong, all in the name of progress. And I already mentioned World War II, but I glanced past what might be considered the heaviest blow ever to strike humanity: Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. Now I wonder, has anyone ever tried to tell you that Hitler was a Christian? Well, was his progress in the name of Christianity? No, it wasn't. The Christianity that he might have identified with was Jesus as a fighter, a Jesus that, quote, recognized these Jews for what they were and summoned men to fight against them. And summoned men to fight against them, and who, God's truth, was greatest, not as a sufferer, but as a fighter. You see, Hitler turned Christianity on its head. He even called biblical Christianity, quote, a filthy reptile that must be stamped on. And there were so-called Christians that supported Hitler. A group called the German Christians helped see the Old Testament ripped up, as well as the letters of Paul, leaving only the biographies of Jesus of Nazareth. And Hitler's Reich bishop preached on love, but a love that had a hard warrior-like face. But in 1941, when Churchill and FDR laid out their vision for a post-Hitler world, they expressed their faith in life, liberty, independence, and religious freedom, and in the preservation of human rights and justice. At this early stage in the war, even before the Allies knew about the extent of Hitler's atrocities, the footing for war was faith in human rights. Both Genesis 1, the creation story, and the Holocaust can teach you the sacredness of life. One is positive, the other negative. And since World War II, the negative has been the louder voice. And since World War II, there's a modern moral consensus summed up best by the great philosopher Indiana Jones. Nazis, I hate these guys. So when the chief architects and executors of the Holocaust were judged, by what righteous standard were they judged? In former times, this standard would have been God. But by the 1940s, this was contested, and instead they were judged with the standard of, quote, crimes against humanity. Well, what do we mean by humanity? How can humanity now replace where God was? Because humanity is both capable of good and is capable of bad. They were both victims and perpetrators. Some selflessly hid the Jews, and some ruthlessly killed them. All humanity. Both sides showed what humanity is capable of. So how did we get to this place of humanity replacing the position of God? Why do both atheists like Steven Pinker and Christians like Scrivener have no sympathy for fascism? On what grounds can we actually condemn Nazism? The truth of the matter is that this can only be explained by 2,000 years of Christian history. But if anyone asks what our foundation is, then we make transcendent claims for humanity. We can explain the what of human rights, but we fail to explain the why without Christian fundamentals. And it can be argued that for the first 19 centuries, our morals were dictated with a pro-Jesus vision. But after World War II, we now have an anti-Hitler vision. Tom Holland summarizes this well. We no longer need the devil because we had Hitler. We no longer needed hell because we had Auschwitz. Whatever the Nazis did, we will do the opposite. If the Nazis pursued racial supremacy, we will pursue racial equality. If the Nazis killed off the weak, well, then we will care for them. We've managed to invert Nazism, but we have not restored the original vision. We pursue abstract values like humanity, rights, freedom, and progress. But without its Christian source, these values prove disconnected. Now, I don't think you see this as much in politics over here in the UK, but especially in the US, where I'm from, if you can't tell from the accent, calling someone a Nazi or even Hitler is becoming more and more common. It almost seems to replace any criticism about a person's beliefs about human rights, or simply just if they think that they are an evil person. Why call someone the devil when you can just call them Hitler? Donald Trump, for example, has been constantly compared to Hitler for his anti-immigration and deportation rhetoric. And we do need to recognize that there are still people today that unfortunately would agree with Hitler's vision and the beliefs of the Nazi Party. In one of the highest positions of government of the US, state governor, right now we have two candidates either that describe themselves as, quote, or did in the past, disputedly, called himself, quote, a black Nazi, or the other guy, the bad guys won World War II. Now this is quite dismal, but there is hope. At the end of his life, Martin Luther King Jr. likened himself to Moses on the mountain, seeing the land promised to the Israelites, but he himself would not be able to enter. In his last speech ever, right before he died, Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land." And within Martin Luther King Jr., we see a life expended in sacrificial love and a hope that went beyond himself. There is a moral arc, but we also know that it's not going to just be a painless rainbow. We will have trouble in this world, but Jesus says, "Take heart, I have overcome the world." And in Revelation 21, we see progress ultimately fulfilled. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." He who was seated on the throne said, "I am making everything new." Then he said, "Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true." Amen. So now I'm going to. Now we're going to go into a time of discussion. So I've come up with 3 different questions. Apparently, I'm not very good at tech because I keep breaking it. Number 1, can our view of progress be attributed to anything other than Christianity? So are you convinced by Glenn Scrivener's argument that it's solely Christianity that we're able to believe in progress? Has he done a good job? What other opinions are there? What other examples can you see in the Bible that he might have left out? Number 2, what do you think is a biblical and healthy view of progress? And then this is something different that we haven't done before, but I want you to read together Isaiah chapter 9, 1 verses 7 together. And I want you to answer the questions, what progress does Isaiah describe? And how are these ideas both realistic and optimistic?
No, I'm not sure.
Caleb?
Can I ask both of you, what does progress mean for you guys?
It's a great question, and one that I wish that Glenn Scrivener kind of defined a bit better of kind of what he wanted to kind of talk about progress. Because, yeah, obviously, you just kind of, you can have progress in so many kind of different ways. Progress within yourself, kind of bettering yourself, but also, progress in society, some sort of kind of, bettering of society and a better kind of way of life, and talked about all the different kind of statistics, of health, and other things that I can't think of, but I think it is something that can be kind of defined, by different people of kind of. They have this vision of what they think, is progress, and that, that's what I explained in, the 20th century in the 1900s, of these people that had a vision of progress, for the best thing for their country, but we would argue against that, that wasn't actually progress. We were going back. So I think this kind of general idea of kind of either, bettering yourself or kind of bettering society. I see you have a definition up. Do you want to read that?
Well, just so I see what the dictionary said, which is, we're making forward movement towards a destination. So this idea of moving forward.
It all depends what the destination is.
It is, and that could obviously be a good or a bad thing, couldn't it? So, but I suppose maybe the point that I took from it, which I think is really interesting, is that, and we were talking about this a bit in our group, that there is almost this idea that everyone talks, like you start talking about this, like this, and you start to ask these questions, really, don't you? Like, what is progress? But I feel like on a kind of like broad cultural level, there is this understanding that progress is a really great thing, and everyone's quite excited about it, and it's a wonderful idea. Or in some sense, it even goes beyond that, and it becomes almost like a politicized, almost threatening idea of progressivism, which is like, akin to left-wing politics and all of that sort of thing. And almost the more interesting question is, well, how did we even get to the point of thinking that in the first place, that progress was a good thing, or And so we were talking in our group about the fact, there is this sense in our culture, I think, of the air that we are all breathing is Christianity. And it feels like, well, why do we assume progress is a good thing when there is really no reason to think that at all? The progress that we're experiencing might be towards something that's worse. And often it looks a lot like it might be getting worse or feels like it's getting worse. So why do we kind of naturally assume that progress is a good thing? And is that because we're so imbued as a culture in this kind of Christian story that, actually the long arc of justice of history does bend towards justice, that we're so embodied in it that we kind of naturally assume it, like our instinctive reaction is to think, that we will progress and things will get better. So I don't know if that really answered the question, but I think that's how I've understood what he was talking about, if that makes sense, that the kind of broad cultural understanding is that progress is a good thing, and the only way that you could come to that conclusion would be from reading the Bible. Otherwise you might not have necessarily a basis to believe that progress was a good thing. It could be an amoral thing or even a bad thing, depending on your viewpoint. But do you want to come back on that, Caleb?
I think from that, I think that I've realised that the value of progress comes from the destination that's in mind. When you talk about society now don't have that clear definition, clear defined destination in mind, then it's just like a free fall. There's no direction of progress. Rather than because we know about the end times, we know the progress of the kingdom of God come to earth. I think that brings more meaning to progress is when you have that set destination. I don't know if that makes sense, but.
It does, doesn't it? Otherwise it can become a bit of like a rod to hit people with as well, can't it? Which I guess is what you see in that kind of like politicization of it, where it's like I'm a progressive, and if you don't get with the program of what I think, then you're somehow bad for society. But it's like what this progressive person says doesn't necessarily match what this progressive person says, and everyone's got their own different idea of what that even means in the first place, and there's no agreed destination, and sadly the result of that is actually just lots of pain and heartache and fighting, and it's not very progressive at all, because it's like the intolerance of saying, well, let's be a tolerant society and we won't tolerate you unless you'll get on board with what we say is tolerance. So it's almost like when the foundations of the idea of we're progressing towards utopia, which is a fundamentally a Christian idea, if the foundations of it are ripped out from underneath it, then it kind of mutates, and it's like something of the idea is left, but it just grows into something quite ugly. And I think that's more or less is what we're seeing, isn't it, across society, is that there's this idea of which everyone's like, or certainly there's a strong emphasis on, we need to think about the rights of all these different groups, and it's hard, I think, as Christians sometimes, because we sign up for that and we believe in it so desperately, but at the same time, because it feels like the foundations of it have been ripped apart, sometimes it's actually, in all sorts of cases, the whole thing becomes quite ugly, because there's no love and there's no compassion, there's no shared vision, there's nobody that's standing outside of it as God and giving those rights to people, and so it feels like it kind of implodes. Yeah. Go on, Peter.
Something I picked up, it was St. Francis of Assisi, and he said, pain is the touchstone to progress. And for myself, I claim spiritual progress, not perfection. And that's what I want to add tonight.
That's good. Thank you, Peter. Did you have anything to come back on that, Skyler? What was just saying?
No.
Okay. Maybe we should jump into number 2 on there, because that feels like it links on, and wonder what you think, Skyler. What are your views on this topic after reading the book? Have they changed? Are they different to what Glenn said?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I didn't expect him to go into different topics that he did when I read Progress. Particularly, I'm like, oh, I get to talk about Nazi Germany this week. I thought that was very surprising. I didn't feel like, but that's obviously a very, a negative, view of progress. Hitler and his party would have seen what they were doing as progress and better for their country and better for people. And we obviously, disagree. And again, it's that thing of destination. I think what I feel like Glenn could have done better is just given more kind of biblical defense on why progress has to come from Christianity. It is something that I believe. He touched on, human rights, and that's something I deeply believe is because of Christianity, and no one else can, defend why we should have human rights without Christianity. It's just something I don't believe is possible. But he touched a lot on kind of, what's happened in the past and kind of what good progress has looked like, what bad progress has looked like. And I just kind of wish that he showed a bit more kind of why it has to be Christianity. What did anyone else have these kinds of ideas of progress? Because it seems really weird that, we had this view of the golden age, to the iron age, and just absolutely no one thought we could get better. You would think someone would have that mindset, can I get better from here? Or it was so doom and gloom without the Bible, that they were. So that's just kind of my personal feelings about the chapter in the book.
I feel like I'm not kind of well read enough to really comment on it, but I think, didn't he talk about the fact that many societies that have existed before Christianity tended to have a more kind of cyclical view? So rather than things going from point A to point B, it was just like you just go round and round and round over and over and over, and things would never improve.
He touched it very briefly in just like a sentence on the kind of secular,
Yeah, because that's just a very interesting idea that, like, because I suppose at the point of which you see the kind of Reformation happening, particularly, there's like a huge shift across the whole of the Western world that then spreads across the world, where all of a sudden people have this thing of, actually I can climb the social ladder and I can kind of come out of poverty and make my own way in life, and just something seems to really change in the atmosphere of the world around that point. And is that to do with technology? I think it's probably part of that, but is it also to do with something to do with like the fact people have all of a sudden got this personal relationship with God? They can see a vision for the future, and it inspires them to get out of bed in the morning and fight for something more. I mean, it's really hard, isn't it, to kind of like read history and understand this stuff in a kind of concrete way. But it is interesting, isn't it, that there is this shift that begins to happen, that as Christianity spreads and embeds itself in culture, what you see there is a form of progress that starts to happen. And we often see that, don't you, actually, that in people's lives, when they turn to Christ, often it has a radical impact upon their life in all sorts of different ways, including often social mobility. For whatever reason, actually starts to have an impact on their economic situation in their life. And in all sorts of ways, life tends to improve when we're following Jesus and we move into that better space. So there's definitely something that's embedded in Christianity about that idea of progress, isn't it? And I guess it's probably very hard to say exactly to what extent has that influenced or not influenced, particularly Western society. I don't know. It's fascinating, though, isn't it? Yeah. Anyone else want to jump in on that one? Cool. Can you have progress without pain, Skyler?
Again, I think it's the kind of whatever definition and kind of thing you're working towards. I think one of the most painless things of progress that can happen is kind of within yourself. And I talked, a bit about, sanctification, and even, people that aren't Christians, try to better themselves and, try to, be better to people and things. And in those certain things, I feel it's pretty painless. You're only just kind of improving your life. You're improving others' lives. You're, you're thinking, of them better and things. But obviously, because we have different definitions of progress, we don't just have one definition. There's always going to be a side that sees your progress as pain. So in that sense, I definitely think there does have to be some sort of pain, unless everyone is somehow all on the same page of where we should be going. There's always going to be pain we have to work through.
Yeah, there is, isn't there? I mean, even in your own life, when you're committed to allowing Jesus to change you and see that as a really good thing, inevitably progress means change, and inevitably change means that you have to let go of things, or things have to die. And that is a painful process, isn't it? To let go, or to let aspects of yourself or society die, or addictions or things we're holding on to let go of those things is never easy, is it? And so I think it's only natural that progress does not happen without considerable pain and difficulty.
So I found a verse when I read that actually. It's a bit long, please follow. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. And I feel like that verse just shows that, because the ultimate goal of progress is that the whole of the nations will be saved. And this verse just shows that that will not happen without our suffering. And when you think about the ultimate sacrifice that Jesus made, in order for us to be saved, he had to suffer. Suffering has to happen in order for preparation.
Yeah, thanks to Davina, it's really good. It's quite sobering as well, isn't it? To think that this is so often the case, and I guess you referenced Martin Luther King a lot tonight as well, Skyler, and particularly in his life. I was really moved actually reading that quote about him peering over the mountain at the promised land. He must have known that his days were quite short. Maybe there'd been some attempts on his life, or he was aware that he was at risk of being assassinated, and yet he was still willing to press forward, knowing that it was worth the personal pain to bring about the progress of the civil rights movement. It's quite astonishing, isn't it, really? It's phenomenal. Final question. The passage shows Jesus is the one who brings progress. Do you think that this means humans should stop trying to orchestrate progress? What do you reckon, Skyler?
It's a good question. So I guess the kind of question, it seems like there's kind of a question, I want to say a question kind of behind the question of kind of, why, why don't we just kind of sit around and kind of wait for Jesus to come again and to make all things new, and ultimately we'll be with him in the new heaven and in the new earth. And so I do think that it does not mean that humans should stop trying to orchestrate progress. We're we're progressing towards, that new heaven and that new earth. And we've been invited by God to join in that progress of sharing the gospel with others, of sharing our testimonies with others, and trying to build the kingdom for God and to progress the kingdom. But we have the reassurance that no matter what we think our kind of skill level is, or are we up for the challenge sort of thing, we can be reassured that God's kingdom will come in all its glory. How He's prophesied it, particularly in this verses of Jesus coming, and then the ultimate kind of being on David's throne for eternity.
That's good, isn't it? I suppose the only thing that I might say is it depends what you mean by that word, orchestrate. Like, it's very much we are, as Skyler said, involved, aren't we? As Jesus' hands and feet, that is here we are as the church. And so Jesus is the one who brings about progress, but the way he does that is through people. But ultimately, I guess he is the one who's orchestrating it through us, which is, I guess, the important point we're making, is that when everyone does progress in their own eyes, according to their own definition, then chaos ensues. But when we have this collective vision that is Jesus, and he is the one who's calling the shots, and we are his servants living under him, who he partners with in order to bring about the kingdom in the world, then, hopefully, prayerfully, there's this beautiful cohesion where we're all coming together, we're all fighting for the same thing, we're all submitting under him. And as we serve him together for this one vision of life, the beauty of the kingdom just bursts forth out of that, and there is a sense of progress, which I hope is a great note to end on, really, because I think this for all of us is hopefully a reason to get out of bed every day and just join in with the mission of the church, because we're all here together fighting for the kingdom, because we believe that there's something beautiful that's created as we come together, as we worship Jesus, as we love the sick and the poor, as we care for one another, that the reality of heaven is breaking into earth.
Someone?
I think that in terms of humans just giving up on orchestrating progress, there are in most especially the ethics of non-Christians, mostly they don't completely disalign themselves with biblical values, which means that they are doing some good in the way that they are acting. And effectively, by saying, should we give up on orchestrating progress? Well, they should give up on orchestrating progress. That's kind of like saying, should they also drop the Christian values that they are, whether they know or not, holding, which kind of means effectively, should they just act completely immoral, which is silly, really. I don't think, yeah.
It's true, isn't it? I think we live in this funny time where, the culture we live in is so been influenced by the ideas of Christianity, and yet God has been removed, and that does result in all sorts of crazy mutations and ugly things in some cases. But also, I'm thankful for it for the vast majority. I was recently at a humanist funeral, which is basically an atheist funeral, but humanism being this idea of almost doing Christianity but without God. And it was a bit listening to the whole, I really enjoyed it because it was also familiar. God wasn't mentioned, and maybe I could have taken offense at that, but I was kind of just very grateful. I was like, well, this is incredible that actually here is an atheist funeral, but the things of God are just so evidently here in everything that's been said, because it is so influenced by him. Even as they closed the funeral, it was like a benediction. It was now go in peace to love and serve one another, or whatever it was. God wasn't mentioned, but he was so a part of it. And I, on the whole, feel really thankful that is there rather than isn't there. I much prefer the humanist funeral to the kind of brutally honest atheist naturalistic funeral of this was just another bunch of atoms, goodbye. I'm thankful for it. Caleb.
I think also there's a sense of you don't. I mean, if you pray, let's say you pray something simple like, "Oh, I pray that I win the lottery." If you never go and win the lottery ticket, then God is never gonna. I know that's a simple one, but like it's in the sense of Jesus. He does orchestrate progress, but God works through our actions as well. I think, and so if we always sit around, then God will never be able to work through us, in a sense. That sort of, I guess, kind of brings into that anxiety of like, not even being able to start wanting to progress, Yes.
No, it's good. Well, thank you guys. We're going to just close, I think, by worshipping the Lord together. So